the world. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Well, my name is Jim Moran. I represented Northern Virginia in the United States Congress for the last 24 years.
So I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for your time. So how have you been doing after you retired?
Well, I'm still vertical, which is a good thing, and I'm doing fine. I'm finally making a little more money than I did in the Congress. When I retired, I didn't own a house nor a car, and now I own both. And so my grandkids are going to be a little better cared for, I suspect, as a result of my retiring. And frankly, nothing is happening in the Congress that would give me reason to regret my leaving it.
Oh, you know what amazed to me? Actually, I watch you being on the show, like on Channel 8 news show, something like that. I thought, oh, that's really good life after you retired. You can go into be on the show all the time.
All the time?
No, I'm kidding.
Maybe not all the time.
I'm kidding. So do you have any plan for the future, so near future?
Well, I want to make myself relevant. I am talking with Virginia Tech. They have a graduate school of public policy, and I may work with them in putting together conferences and seminars, doing some teaching, perhaps providing some orientation for the freshman classes of Congress that used to be done at the Kennedy Center until Newt Gingrich killed that idea. But I'd like to see Virginia Tech, George Mason, UVA, all be more involved in what goes on in Capitol Hill because of their proximity and the fact that those campuses represent a large number of people who work for the executive and the legislative branches of government.
It's a young leader, of course, is the future of the U.S. You recently was a part of a town hall on the Iran nuclear deal. How do you feel about that deal?
It's a good deal. It's exactly what we should have done. The alternative is not acceptable. The alternative is that Iran would develop a nuclear weapon to defend itself because it would have been isolated from the rest of the world. The people who would have more and more power would have been the military and the mullahs, because when you're shut out from the rest of the world, they're the ones that are able to control the commerce and control what people are thinking. It's only when you open up a society to other points of view that society begins to demand for democracy and a certain amount of free enterprise. So what we were doing, just as what we did with Cuba, was just the opposite from what we stated was our purpose.
I think now we open the society. What the role do you think Iran can play in the Middle East crisis? Iran
can be a stabilizing factor in the Middle East. Iran is not an Arab nation. It's a very stable Persian civilization that has existed for thousands of years. Iran used to be America's foremost ally. Now we say it's Israel, but the reality is that until we messed it up by interfering in their democratic process because we were afraid that their leadership would take over some control of the oil fields that we were exploiting for our benefit and for that of the British, we went in and we deposed a guy by the name of Mossadegh, and then put in the Shah, which was an imposition on the democratic process. And in fact, he was brutal in requiring people to be more secular, more Western oriented. It was an objective of ours, but the way in which he accomplished it through secret police and through brutal interrogations and torture did not help the United States reputation. And then, of course, when the Shah was brought to the United States to deal with his cancer, that's when the revolution occurred. But the revolution was inevitable because this was a large nation being basically controlled by the U.S. and Britain, and to some extent the rest of Europe, and they weren't going to tolerate it. And of course, when you have revolutions, it's usually the extremist forces that take over. And Iran has been run largely by extremists for the last generation. But if you open it up, the economy, the society, to the rest of the world, that's bound to change. And that's why I think that this Iranian nuclear deal is very much in America's interests, and in the long run, it's in the interests of the Middle East as a whole.
I think you are in pioneer. So I saw that this nuclear Iran deal, Iran nuclear deal. So many people concerned will not pass in Congress, but you were just few of them. So stand up, say this is the good deal. I mean, I watched the TV. I saw you were stand up the bill. You say it should pass.
Well, it clearly was a good deal, and if you talk with most of the Iranian Americans in this country, they feel it was a good deal because they know that at heart, Iran is a liberal country in terms of being an open society, an open economy, and leading the Middle East. It's just that it's been an aberration for the last generation, and some of that, as I said, was partly our doing. And so this is a way to get rid of the military's control over the economy, to move aside the religious orthodox, and to give an opportunity for the young people who make up the vast majority of Iran today, to give them an opportunity to be able to show what they can do in the area of technology, of entrepreneurism. It's a very young population, a very well-educated, very intelligent population, and we need to let them breathe the air of freedom. And I think in the long run, this Iranian nuclear deal will lead to that eventuality.
When the nuclear deal passed, the whole country, especially the young people in Iran, they cheered up. That's very good.
Well, it's also, let me mention something we forget. After 9/11, the streets of Iran filled up, particularly in Tehran, the capital, filled up with Iranians sympathetic to the United States and in sympathy and empathy with the United States. They were very much with us. You didn't see that in Saudi Arabia. You didn't see that in some of these the putative allies. You didn't even see it that much in Israel as much as happened in Iran. So they're natural allies if we gave them an opportunity and created the right situation. But then the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush, declared that they were part of the axis of evil, and that's really what set our relations with Iran back, way back, and it just showed a lack of understanding on his part, and a very short-sighted attempt to get a good phrase that essentially didn't mean anything. Iran and Iraq had been at odds for a long time, and so to say that Iran, Iraq, and North Korea are the axis of evil just showed a gross lack of understanding on the part of the president and his neocon advisors.
Yeah, that's a good point. I heard about the Iranian people, they kind of push up the government to want to call for the very good relationship with U.S. That's correct. So you mentioned to the extremists in the Middle East. So what is the ISIS?
What is ISIS?
The ISIS is doing kind of in that region very actively, right?
Yes.
What is
ISIS
the
now
group?
is about 28,000 people.
Why so many people join in? What is attracting them?
Well, I can give you some.
Too many questions.
No, it's not. It's an appropriate question. I can give you a logistical answer. I can give you, an academic answer. But some of it is a psychological answer. There are a lot of young people looking to be part of something greater than themselves. And when you're young, you're impressionable enough to think that there can be a perfect world. And you look for how you might bring about a perfect world. In many cases, young people will, immature minds, if you will look to religion for perfection. In other cases, they'll look for political power. There are other things that will attract them. In this case, the extremism of ISIS attracts them. ISIS has been very adept at using social media to make them believe that they're creating a new state, a perfect state, a state that reflects what Muhammad wanted as revealed in the Quran. Now, they're nuts. They don't know what they're talking about. They're not well educated, these people in ISIS. Most of them have been rejected in previous roles in their life. But they're led in large part by military generals and officers that we expelled from Iraq. These people were in positions of responsibility, and we kicked them out, not knowing what we were doing, of course, in the first decade of the 21st century. And so not only for their livelihood, but for their own dignity, if you will, they are now in major positions within the ISIS framework. We shouldn't call it ISIS. We should call it Daesh, which is a pejorative term that Secretary Kerry uses. But the reality is that they've been gaining strength. They've recruited even 250 young American kids, 150 in the last year.
Thank you. We will take a break.
Oh.
Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about nothing very nice. Homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water. At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site. That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff. You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Xinyuzhng. I'm having Congressman Jim Moran with me on Channel 10. So we talk about the ISIS, and they pretend to construct a state. They even think about print the money. That's correct?
Yes, they want to be able to do everything that a modern day state does. But they have very little capacity for governance. So I think they're going to be remarkably unsuccessful in doing that. And of course, they rule people through fear and violence. While they may be successful in that approach for a short time, in the long run, that does not work. So ISIS isn't going to last. They're going to kill a lot of people in the process. They're going to make it very difficult to put back together Syria and Iraq, for that matter. They've sown destruction in their wake, and now they control 4 major cities, and it's going to be hard to dislodge them without killing a lot of innocent people in the process. So it doesn't look very good right now.
What can you tell us about the latest developments in the fight against ISIS? I mean, many neighbors countries, they spread out the ISIS. Then the Russia gets involved in.
Yeah.
It means, what is the latest development?
Well, the latest development is Russia's entry into the fray. The Saudis, I think, are a little conflicted because many people from Saudi Arabia did contribute to the formation of ISIS by giving them resources. The Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia is a core part of the problem we have with Islamic extremism, not only in the Middle East but in South Asia as well. But you have Bahrain, and you have Qatar, and then you have Turkey and Jordan and Syria and Iraq, and now most of Europe is adversely affected by Syria, and they're all turning to the United States to solve the problem. It's going to be much more difficult to solve it now that President Putin has decided to be a major player in Syria.
How is the result, you guess? They try to coordinate with other countries, several countries.
I can't predict the result. I do think that Putin is going to be relatively successful. Russia has economic and military interests. They have a major port, a naval base in Syria on the shore of the Mediterranean. They're going to protect that naval base. They're going to protect their commercial interests. And this is an opening for them to be a major player in the Middle East. And unfortunately, they've been sending in weaponry that is not designed to fight an army that is only on the ground, that doesn't have anything like fighter jets. They're bringing in, Russia is, fighter jets. They're bringing in anti-missile systems. They're bringing in the kind of military weaponry that you would normally use to fight an advanced nation like the United States. So that's a cause for major concern. But Russia is probably going to be successful in propping up the Assad regime. And so all of these lives that have been lost will largely have been lost in vain.
Does the situation in Syria get worse because so many people fleeing from the government?
Yeah, there isn't much of Syria left if you count its people. Millions of people have been displaced. Millions are trying to leave the Middle East to move into Europe. It's interesting, one of the things that people don't fully understand is that the Sunni Syrians who were being attacked by the Assad government were poorer because they had been marginalized by the Alawite government, which is a Shia sect. So they didn't have very good jobs. They didn't have a lot to lose. They went to refugee camps in Jordan, in Turkey, and in Iraq, and in Lebanon. They're still living lives of poverty. But recently, because of the gains with ISIS, The people who are leaving are the middle class Shia folks who were better cared for, more successful under the Assad regime. So those are the middle class who don't want to go to a refugee camp in the Middle East. They want to become integrated economically and socially in Europe, and that's why they're determined to get into Greece, Italy, France, Germany, and we'll probably take about 65,000. Secretary Kerry says 100,000. Initially it was 10,000. I think it'll probably be somewhere in between. So there'll be a lot of Syrian middle class people coming to this country, not the people who would likely become terrorists. These are older, established families that we'll be letting in.
Should other countries like Europe, Turkey open the door to all the refugees? How to solve that?
The answer is yes, because it's going to save Europe. Europe is old. It's becoming calcified. A very low rate of births per family. If Germany brings in these middle-class Syrians who are willing to work harder for less money, it's going to rejuvenate their economy. So it's interesting that the countries who are the most generous, the less nativist, are the ones who are going to benefit the most economically, because every nation in Europe needs a booster shot. And these folks will have far greater respect for the freedoms that Europe offers than any of the folks who were born in Europe today.
What are the solutions for the Syrian crisis? Because do you think it's Assad left immediately? That's possible the solution?
President Putin is going to see to it that Assad stays, and that was probably the most predictable outcome. But we had a lot of people who wanted to remove Assad, and we were being pushed by the Israelis to do so. The reality is that there wasn't any leadership that could have taken over control of the country. The revolutionaries were disparate. They were not well armed. They were not particularly experienced militarily, and so they weren't going to be successful unless the United States was willing to make the same mistake we made in Iraq again in Syria. And President Obama was not willing to do that. You know, if you break something, you ought to own it. We broke Iraq. Now we're going to say, well, that's their problem. They're going to have to fix it. But this is after thousands of lost American lives and hundreds of billions of dollars. It'll probably cost us $2 to $3 trillion. We also would have lost a lot of lives in Syria. It would have cost us an enormous amount of money, and we probably wouldn't have been left with a country that was any more stable than Iraq is today. So we couldn't have gone in and fixed it. The situation may continue to deteriorate, and Assad will probably wind up controlling the country with the assist of Russia, Putin, and then over time will transition to perhaps a more inclusive form of government. That's the best we could hope for.
Have you any other continuing solutions the U.S. can play in that region?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of things the U.S. could do in the Middle East. One of them is what President Obama is trying to do, is to open up Iran, which is the most stable country in the world. Another is to resolve the problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Israelis have got to stop taking land from the Palestinians. You can't throw 780,000 people out of their home and then expect that there aren't going to be any repercussions. This isn't the early 19th century when the Americans the European settlers got away with exterminating the Native Americans. You can't do this in the latter part of the 20th and the first part of the 21st century. The world has a collective resolve that you can't commit genocide against people, that people have a right to be able to govern themselves. And so if we could stabilize the Israeli-Palestinian situation, that would take from the enemies of the United States and of Israel probably their most compelling rallying cry. That we don't stand consistently on the side of justice and democracy. So if we could resolve the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, if we could open up Iran and let the young people rule that, and then if we could stand up to the Saudis and their funding of radical extrerism within their own country, which then is exported to places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. Those are things we could do that would bring about a more peaceful, stable, and I think a long-run prosperous world as well.
Yeah, if people want to achieve the peace in Middle East, should stop the war immediately, right? That's the solution for, I think everybody wish get there too. So we are so happy having Congressman Jim Moran with me. Thank you for watching. We will see you next time. Thank you for joining me. I'm a little bit nervous.